Great to see you. If we've not met before, my name's Dave. I'm the minister here, and I suppose it's quite a challenge for us thinking about some of the hard questions, particularly suffering. We have lots of services on a Sunday, so I've already listened to 3 sermons on suffering today, and you can listen to stuff that we do online, and you can get Bible study notes. And I suppose we want to take these subjects seriously and think, how do we get our head around some of the big questions of life? Questions that sometimes stop people coming to faith, or questions that arise during our Christian journey that can sometimes really throw us off course. And suffering is one of those huge issues that is for all of us. You know, just this morning, I was talking with a lady downstairs at one of our earliest service, and she's a lady in her 30s, just had a baby, not been married for very long, just for a couple of years, and just been diagnosed very recently with a really aggressive breast cancer, and not really sure whether her prognosis means she's going to make it or not. You know, just talking, praying with her. That's a huge issue for her, for her husband, for the little child that's been wanted and loved. And then in our next service, Rachel Riddle, who leads our Alpha course, was speaking, and she was just telling some of her own story. I remember really vividly getting a phone call from my colleague Tim to say that just the church youth club, they'd come out of the church youth club and there'd been an accident, and little Sam Riddle was seriously injured, and in fact he was killed at the scene of this hit and run car accident just outside the church youth club, you know, and Rachel and Martin, part of our church family and on team, having to process that huge tragedy in their lives, and Rachel was sharing her story, and I was in tears, and I know a lot of us were in tears, because suffering isn't just something we can talk about in abstract. Suffering is something that happens to people like us. And I want to, I suppose, speak to 3 sorts of people tonight. I want to speak to people who may be here tonight, you may be listening online, but you may be someone who, for you, the idea that a God of love can allow the kind of suffering that we experience in our world is something that you just really can't get your head around. It's for you, it's a significant blockage to faith. And then the second group of people I want to speak to are people perhaps who haven't suffered. And you've got some thoughts and feelings about suffering, but it's a little bit unreal at the moment. It's a little bit theoretical. And maybe for you, you feel that because you are a person of faith, kind of, you know, God's got hold of you and life is going to be pretty good. And I suppose the third group of people I want to speak to are people who are suffering, who have suffered, and perhaps for you in particular, but I hope for all of us, we can find a place where worship doesn't push us away from God, but draws us to God. That worship isn't so much a place of doubt as a place that leads us to worship. And I'll see if we can get there. And I'm aware that in speaking, it's a bit like, you know, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And you might feel that the things that I say are a little bit glib tonight, and that I haven't really got the right to speak about these things if I haven't really suffered as intensely as you have. And I'm sure, and in fact I know, that there are people here today who've suffered in all kinds of ways far more than I have. So I just want to offer this stuff to you, and I don't want to offer it glibly. I want to offer you it reflectively. And just as a disclaimer, I'll say that I've had a great life. I've had a really happy childhood and adult life. I've got a happy marriage. I've got 5 wonderful grown-up children, some of whom are in the room tonight, and who share my faith, which is a real privilege. I live in a community house with a whole bunch of people who love and support me, and that's wonderful. On the other hand, when I left university, I decided that I needed to get some people skills, so I trained as a nurse with people with learning difficulties, but worked in general hospital and in what used to be called mental subnormality hospitals, and worked with people with mental health problems and learning difficulties and profound physical handicaps. And then, as I've been working for church, I've surrounded with people all the time who suffer. And in my house, if I look at the photos of people who I've lived with since I've been living in community, I look at the picture of somebody who took their own life, somebody who died of a drug and alcohol overdose, somebody who died as a 40-year-old suddenly, leaving 3 small children behind. And suffering as well has marked my close family, you know, and my wife, whose mother died when she was 12 and whose brother died when he was 29. And actually death has been something that I have had close encounters with. And just this year, walking through the terminal illness of a friend of mine with motor neuron disease, just a little bit older than me, someone who was a friend of mine, and we met together every week and more often as he faced his death, and we processed that together. So I have some familiarity with suffering. And I don't believe that I'm exempt from it. So that's just by way of background. And I guess, though, I have to say that I am suffering averse. Does anyone join me in that one? You know, I try to avoid it where possible. And one of the worrying things I notice in myself, that I'm quite tempted to sin to avoid suffering. I don't know if any of the rest of you are. I mean, I put it like this. I will sometimes be economical with the truth because I don't want to get into trouble, because I don't want to have to face the consequences of my action. In other words, I'd like to sin to avoid that sort of suffering. And what is suffering in any case? Suffering has all kinds of dimensions to it. There is suffering which is physical pain. And there's the suffering which is emotional pain. And the suffering that is relational pain. And I don't know which is worse. I was talking with someone on Saturday saying, what's worse, physical pain or mental pain? They're saying, well, the thing is you can't switch your mind off. And an emotional pain that leaves you grieving. Perhaps you've been bereaved, or perhaps you've been in a relationship that's broken up. And perhaps something's happened to you in a relationship that the whole course of your life has been changed. And you're living with what might have been, or ache, or betrayal, or dissatisfaction, a whole range of things. Pain comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And sometimes, if you're like me, suffering averse, you think, well, maybe if I'm a Christian and if I'm good, and if I'm part of the family of God, I'm going to be okay. And I've come to faith because I want to avoid suffering. And yet, when we look at the pages of Scripture, it seems to be that the followers of Jesus, far from being exempt from suffering, are some of the people who suffer the most. And the Jesus who heals people and feeds people and comforts people is also the Jesus who says, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me. And there are some specific sufferings that seem to be particularly associated with being a follower of Jesus, somebody who loves God and serves God. Now, I think we can understand that there's pain in the world. We can understand that there are mechanisms that we need in the world to show us something that's gone wrong. C.S. Lewis wrote a very famous book about suffering called The Problem of Pain. And he described pain as God's megaphone, something which alerts us that there's something wrong with the world. And it's a great and familiar description. And I think, great, I need to know when I'm in danger. And whether that's physical danger, so that if I put my hand on the hot plate of an oven, I withdraw it, so as my flesh doesn't burn, I can understand why pain might be useful. And I may understand, too, why I might experience pain in a relationship if I'm mistreating somebody and there's a reaction. I think my problem with pain isn't so much that there's pain, but it's the degree of pain, the intensity of pain, and the longevity of pain. You know, a little twinge, I could work with that. But there is an intensity of pain which is scary, isn't there? And I guess you know that. And I suppose what the Bible seems to suggest is that even before the world was spoilt, there was pain. The Bible talks about and gives us a picture of creation with God creating a good universe. But in that good universe, there's also pain. In fact, when things go wrong in the Genesis story and Adam and Eve fall, God says, I will increase your pain. In fact, he actually said, I will greatly increase your pain in childbirth. But the implication was there was pain before creation. But something that's gone wrong with the world has made pain worse. And I want to ask you to reflect with me, is that your experience? Do things going wrong, human carelessness, sin, wickedness, or whatever it is, do those things make pain worse? Do those things make suffering worse? And does God's stuff in creation make suffering better? I think there's something wrong with creation, and I think that the things that are wrong with it increase suffering. So, for instance, pain in childbirth, I've never experienced that. I have, however, been at the birth of my 5 children. Perrin, it was messy. No, he's always been messy. To be honest, my wife, Tina, is tiny and didn't have any pain relief at any of her births, not gas and air, nothing. And she went into labour and came out of it saying, when can we have the next one? and would say that it was one of the most fulfilling experiences of her life. Now, one reason why that was true is because Tina went into labour, well, obviously with a loving and caring husband. You know, and I'm available. No, I'm not available. But she went without fear, and she went with faith. And I'm not saying that just, you know, that there can be real complications in pregnancy. But what I am saying, that in our experience, faith and love and an absence of fear made the whole experience far less painful. However, I think I can imagine for a woman giving birth in fear, in loneliness, in isolation, even a normal pregnancy would be far more intense and painful than that. All I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that good things reduce suffering. I mean, those good things that reduce suffering include drugs, legal ones, and illegal ones, but you know how it is. But are drugs a gift of God in creation? I think so. I think they're part of what God has given to limit suffering in the world. I think there are all kinds of things that limit suffering in the world. My dad died as a 92-year-old. He was born in 1916. He was born in poverty in urban Cornwall. And when he was 14, he contracted tuberculosis of the lung and was coughing up blood and was in hospital for 3 years and then continued in hospital work for a while and was surrounded by people who died like flies. As a young man, not eligible for work, to be called up to be in the Second World War, he volunteered to be an air raid warden and spent his war really in the Blitz, dealing with people in bombed houses and all that kind of stuff. And as a kid, he used to say to me, David, that there is a limit to suffering. The body can only cope with so much. There comes a point when you pass out. There comes a point when you lose consciousness. There are things that can limit suffering. And, you know, he was someone who's seen a bit of life, and I took comfort from that because, as I said, I'm suffering averse. But I do believe that God has put things into creation that help us to cope with suffering. And the Bible pictures that even from the fall, of God intervening to limit suffering. And I think that my own feeling is that cruelty, malice, evil increase suffering. Let me give an example. How many people here have ever been the victim of cruelty? Perhaps you've been bullied. Perhaps you've been abused. Perhaps you've been attacked or beaten up. You may have been sexually attacked or raped. There will be people here, I'm sure, who can identify with that. Now, it may be that the physical suffering that you experience in those circumstances is far less profound than some other suffering you've had. You may have, had a broken limb at some point, or whatever it is. But my guess is that the impact of cruelty and evil and malice on you is far more profound than pain itself. I've only ever been beaten up once in my life. It was when I lived in Leeds, and I was about 13, and I was playing football with some friends, and this gang of lads approached us, and my friends ran away, and for some reason I didn't. I was foolish. But I was beaten up then by people that I didn't know, that I'd never hurt, that I'd never done anything wrong to. And I wasn't badly hurt physically, but emotionally on my inside, I was profoundly hurt because my worldview was shaken. People who I'd never offended, people I'd done nothing, people who didn't know me, hurt me for no other reason than they wanted to do that. That was a very disturbing thought, a very disturbing experience. And I think it's experiences like that of evil that really compound suffering. And whatever else, I want to suggest to you that the creation itself is not as God intended in its fullness. The Bible speaks about a creation that is broken. And when there are things that are broken, mechanisms that are there to protect, warnings that are there to protect, go wrong. If you've got a car and its brakes are working, the wheels are going to get hot a little bit when you put the brakes on. But when the brakes are broken, they're going to get red hot. They could be really damaging. And our world is a world where the mechanisms, I think, that are there to protect us have gone wrong, and suffering has increased, but I think evil has increased it more. And so much of suffering does come down to the way that the human race treats the human race, whether it's in the local specific detail of someone being cruel to somebody else, or whether it's in the global evil of one powerful group of people financially exploiting another group of people, treating people like things, treating people appallingly without even realizing it, just to maintain an over-affluent lifestyle. And we actually find ourselves colluding with things that cause suffering in the world, and that's true for all of us. So, suffering, I suggest that it's there in creation. I suggest that sin and evil, the way we collude with it, makes it worse. And I also suggest that the higher the order of creation, the more suffering is possible for you. Let me stay with this a little bit. Has anyone ever kept stick insects? They eat privet, don't they? Yeah, it's not nice. I've had stick insects and they've died. And my grief and mourning over them has not been profound. And I don't think their suffering has been very profound. I haven't kept them recently, by the way. This was a long time ago. I can remember though, when I had a dog called Judy, half collie, half spaniel, a dog I was really fond of. When my dog died, it was more that dog suffered more than the stick insects, and our relationship was a lot closer. What I'm trying to say is, I think that the more sophisticated, the higher the order of creation, the more the capacity there is to suffer. Robots don't suffer. Computers don't suffer. Insects, I don't think they suffer that much. I reckon maybe a chimpanzee or a dolphin could suffer quite a lot. I think a human being could suffer more than that. I think a deeply loving human being could suffer more than a hardened, cold human being. I think loving and creative people have a power to suffer that's enhanced. Do you agree with that? Mothers suffer because they love their children. And when I think about what would the highest form of love and creativity look like, I think that looks like God. I think that God is the most loving being on the planet. I think God is the most creative person on the planet. I think God is the most aware, the most sentient being of all. And I think God suffers the most. I think that's something that the Christian revelation says about God. It says it early in Scripture. In Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 6 rather, it says, when God looked at creation, when he looked at human beings, when he saw the evil in the world, it said his heart was full of pain. And sometimes we talk about the sum of human suffering, and we kind of abstract it all, and we think about all that's happening. And today we could think about the suffering in the world. We could think about what's happening in Syria and northern Iraq, and we could think what's happening in the Congo and in the West African states and Sierra Leone and the Ebola outbreaks. And we could think about Nigeria. We could think about in North Korea and the concentration camps. And we could think about children dying of hunger and malnutrition. And we could think about many, many things. But we can only cope with so much. But the Bible tells us that God knows every hair on our head, sees every sparrow that falls, hears every cry of the widow and orphan. And the only one who can really know about the sum of human suffering and live it and experience it and not switch off from it is God himself. The Greeks had an idea of God as the unmovable mover, someone who set it up in motion, set the universe in motion, and was untouched by human sin and suffering, detached from creation. And the Hebrews taught about a God who was passionately involved in creation, who heard the cry of the slaves in Egypt, who heard the cry of the widow and the orphan, who had a heart for justice, who became passionately angry at the injustices of the world. It speaks, the Bible, about a God who came into creation himself, who, when there was no one there to bring salvation, when all the strategy of raising up a people himself had fallen short, came into creation himself, sent Jesus into the world, God incarnate, God with skin on, God who never needed to suffer, able to feel what we feel, able to suffer with his body, able to suffer with his emotions, able to suffer relationally. A God with skin on who never sinned, who never fought back, who never cursed, but a being who, at the end of his life, drank a cup of suffering, identifying with us and for us, who at the cross betrayed relationally, abandoned, tortured, hanging on the cross, offered medicine, said, no, I'm not going to have the wine mixed with gall, I'm drinking a cup of suffering. A God who'd always known the fellowship, the intimate love of his Father, on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that place of complete and utter loneliness and separation, drinking a cup of human suffering. I remember hearing a song by Kevin Prosh. You might not know him, you might be too young, but Christian musician, worship leader. It's based on 1 Corinthians 13 about love. Love suffers long, he sang. Love, 1 Corinthians 13, love there describes God to us, doesn't it? God is patient, God is kind. And God is long-suffering. And I believe that God is long-suffering. And I mean that I believe that our God is a suffering God. Jürgen Moltmann, theologian, wrote a book, The Crucified God. Speaks about a God who suffers. This is a radical, this is a unique thing for us to celebrate. The God who made the universe is not the unmovable mover, but as the theologian Clark Pinnock said, he's the most moved mover, a God of love. And because he loves, he suffers. And because he loves, he identifies with a suffering world. And we have a big question, why? And it may be, why this? Why me? It's easier to reflect about suffering in abstract, and I'm aware that C.S. Lewis, who wrote that book, The Problem of Pain, wrote a second book, A Grief Observed, when his beloved wife died of cancer. And it's a very different book. And maybe, even as I'm speaking tonight, you may think I'm being superficial in what I'm saying. But I believe that the God who made it all is somebody who says to us that suffering is not the worst thing, and that it's possible for suffering to be clean. I don't know whether you know what I mean by that. But Sometimes suffering is good for us. I'm going to the dentist tomorrow. I may suffer, but I'm sure it will be good for me. But sometimes suffering is bad for us, and it comes from malice. John Wimber, one of my heroes, used to say, suffering will make you bitter or make you better. But suffering isn't the worst thing in the world, because as I've told you, I'm tempted to sin to avoid suffering. Jesus was willing to suffer to deal with sin. That's what the story of the cross is actually all about. It's about a God entering into our world to be somebody who can take and break those powers of evil and malice that we collude with, that are involved in creation, spoiling and hurting it, that bring us into cycles of further hurt and damage. And that the world at the moment has an urgent need of a different message, a message of grace, a message of mercy, a message of love, a message of forgiveness, a message that says justice is satisfied by the one who bears the sin of the world. And the only person who could ever possibly do it, God himself, God's Son, Jesus Christ. And we need that. And we're invited into fellowship with that man of sorrows. Rachel said this morning. Rachel, as she looked back on 5.5 years as a mother who'd lost her son, said, I'm a different woman from the woman that I was 5.5 years ago, but I have a more intimate relationship with God now. My experience of suffering, such as it is that it is not the worst thing. The worst thing is that you lose yourself. That person that God created you to be is distorted, diminished by avoidance of suffering, and therefore colluding with evil powers, or diminished in the suffering by the way it makes you bitter, by the way it causes you to step away from God, to step away from people, to stay away from community, to be like the old Simon Garfunkel song. Do you know that song, I am a rock, I'm an island? You're too young again, aren't you? But he says, don't talk of love. I've heard that word before. He says, I've got my books, my poetry to protect me. A rock never cries. But we can make those kind of withdrawal, and actually we lose our humanity. But there's something about true humanity that in the most appalling suffering can find that suffering itself is not the worst thing. One of the archetypes of suffering that we all know are the concentration camps of the Holocaust. An unspeakable evil where more than 6 million Jews and gypsies and people with mental health issues and all kinds of people were systematically and cruelly abused, killed, tortured, living like slaves. Famously, there was a man in Auschwitz called Viktor Frankl. Some of you will have heard of him. He was a psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist before the war, and he survived the Holocaust. His wife and all his family members died in the Holocaust, but he survived. And in one of his books, he describes an experience of the power of love. Viktor Frankl was not spoilt by his experience of the Holocaust. He didn't become a bitter man. He actually grew in his professional skill after the war. He continued to practice, and as a psychiatrist, he wrote books. He was a source of healing. But he describes being on a forced march with the Nazis, and next to someone, just both of them remembering their wives, saying, what if our wives could see us now? And then he had this picture of his wife in his mind, and it was such a sustaining thing. He says this, a thought transfixed me for the first time in my life. I saw the truth, as is said in the song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers, the truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secrets that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart, the salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. In the position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honourable way, in such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." Words of Viktor Frankl, a believer in God, surviving intact in his humanity through concentration camp. There's just two scripture readings I'd like to put up. The first one from the book of Lamentations. There was a real low point in the history of God's people in the Old Testament when the armies of Babylon finally overran Jerusalem, broke down its walls, carried its people into captivity, murdered, raped, destroyed the temple. The great prophet of Israel was Jeremiah, a man who'd for decades looked at the increasing nightmare that was coming on his country, a man who prophesied and prayed and wept, the weeping prophet Jeremiah. And finally, it happens, the destruction of his nation. And there's a book called Lamentations, which is believed to have been written by Jeremiah, but it's written at the heart of the suffering. And this is what comes from the middle of Jeremiah. It says this: "I remember my affliction, my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It's good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke while he's young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust, there may yet be hope." This is, let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. Jesus took that literally, didn't he? Let him be filled with disgrace, for no one is cast off by the Lord forever. This is Jeremiah at the lowest point of all, saying, there's hope. God is good. He says in Lamentations, God does not willingly afflict or grieve the Son of Man. In that place of desolation, there's an intimacy with God that Jeremiah finds. Paul finds it. Paul, great follower of Jesus, a man who suffers. He suffered from the beginning. And in 2 Corinthians, he writes about his sufferings. He writes about the physical sufferings that he goes through. He writes about being in prison, being flogged, being exposed to death, having the 40 lashes. He talks about the emotional, relational suffering he goes through. So you can move the slide on if you want to. That'd be kind. The dangers he has. Next slide. He talks about the pressure that comes from being a servant of God and the concern of the churches. He's actually identifying with the suffering of Jesus, who's head of the church, and sees suffering there. For Paul, following God means to suffer. And yet this is what Paul says in Philippians: I want to know him, about Jesus, and to have the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. I'm going to finish in a moment or two. And I want to speak to those three groups of people that I spoke to at the beginning. I want to say to the seeker about suffering, where we ask the question, why? I want to say to you that suffering is an ontological reality. I want to say that because it makes me sound educated. But I really want to say what it means is that life and suffering go together. The potential to have feeling, to have awareness, to have a sense of being other from something else. To have those things means that you are going to have the potential to suffer. In creation, suffering is there. It cannot not be. The question is, how do we deal with suffering in this life? And so I say to the Christian who maybe has not yet suffered profoundly, I want to say, get your theology of suffering right now before you suffer, because you will. Along the way, we're going to have bodies that fail, relationships that fail. We're going to have to look death in the face. And we live in a world where suffering is one of the inevitables, be it small, be it large. And if we believe that somehow we're exempt from suffering because we're Christians, that's not biblical thought. You know how it is in Scripture, John 9. Jesus meets the blind man. And the disciples think, well, he must have done something wrong if he's suffering like that. Who sinned? This man or his parents? He was born blind. And the Greek could be translated like this. Jesus said to them, neither, but this happened. It happened. I'm not giving you an answer. Just like Job doesn't get an answer for why he suffers. But, Jesus says, while it's day, we must do the work of him who sent me. And our job, whenever we encounter suffering in ourselves and in other people, is to meet it with the mercy of God, to meet it with the compassion of God, to meet it with the fellowship of God. Not to come out with a theological put down to say you're suffering because you're sinful. Not to come out with a kind of glib or quick answer for people who are suffering, but to be there, to be God's hands and feet, to be there as Jesus was there, that man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, who spent his time with the marginalized, who hung out with the outcasts, who healed the lepers, who met the widow with her only son on a coffin and said, don't cry, and raised him up, who put himself in positions of danger so that he could be the hands and feet of the Father of lights in whom there's no darkness, the one who loves, the one who so loved the world that he sent his only Son, Father and Son and Holy Spirit together suffering, that we might be saved. And I want to say to those who are suffering, or the Christian who understands some of this stuff, you have the authority to speak to a world and tell them what you've discovered. That God is love. That God is full of mercy. That God is... He's not the unmoved mover. He's not the angry judge. He's the one whose heart goes out to us as Jesus' heart went out to us. He's the one whose Son, Jesus Christ, still has the nail prints in his hand. That's our God, rich in mercy. And we can have an intimacy with God because we've suffered. Peter said, let no man trouble me. I bear on my body the marks of suffering. He who has suffered in his body is done with sin, he said. Rachel spoke with such authority this morning. And as she leads our Alpha course, she's not someone who's going to give a glib and trite answer. But she said this morning, when all I had was Jesus, that's when I discovered that Jesus is all I needed. When all I had was Jesus, that's when I discovered that Jesus was all I needed. Like Jeremiah, like Paul. And the last word of all is resurrection. The last word of all is a new heaven and a new earth. The last word of all is a God who wipes every tear from our eye. And that's been made possible because of Jesus. The last word of all, an invitation to become part of that community of faith that will witness for him in this lifetime and share in that resurrection that is promised for each one of us. Now, I just hope that's helpful. And we're going to just go back into a little bit of worship now. And it's a chance to pray for people. And here at Woodlands, one of our values is that we want to do the works of him who sent us. Just like Jesus when he encountered that blind man and said, well, the Father's heart is to do something about this. We want to do something about it. And it might be tonight that you want to be freshly someone who can go into a suffering world and be Jesus' hands and feet. That's a call to mission, whether it's locally in this city, where you are, or overseas. It might be that tonight you're somebody who yourself is suffering, or you have friends who suffer. And it's extraordinary what happened. That suffering may be ancient or recent. last Sunday, some of you here may have heard, for instance, that there was a word shared about someone, the picture of a leather belt saying that somebody as a child was abused by beating, and actually someone responded to that word and found some help and support and counsel for the first time. And we don't know what we're encountering and uncovering as we do life together as a community, but I know there's suffering here, and our ministry team would love to pray with you tonight. And I suppose I'd just like to get the cross out to the front and hold it really for a banner over us and say that what we're going through, God is not oblivious to, God is not ignorant of. This is our symbol for us followers of Jesus. This is what Jesus says, come and take this up. Come and take up this cross. And not that I want to cause you to suffer, but I want to invite you to share in my sufferings, that you may share in my glory, and that you might be my ministers. Jesus invites wounded healers to follow him. And they're the best, actually. They're the best. They really are. So, as we go into worship, if you want to come, please come. We'll just invite you to come. And we've got a ministry team. And if you're carrying your sorrows, or if you're wanting just to be equipped and empowered to be that minister, then whatever the reason, we'd love to come and pray for you. You might want to just come to the cross and touch it. And leave some of your suffering there, or identify with Jesus who suffers for you. But whatever you are, you come. Let's stand up as we go back into worship.